Hi, and thanks for clicking. Recognise this? Yes, of course you do. It's that thing Romans always wear in TV shows and films. It's called the Lorica Segmentata, and it's a type of armour the Romans wore between the 1st century and the 3rd century AD. It's iconic really, isn't it? We recognise it from all sorts. In this vlog, I'm going to be looking at how it was worn, the pros, the cons of it, and how it fared against other types of armour the Romans wore at the same time. I dare say I'll be putting on as well, assuming it still fits. At the end of the vlog, we'll be looking at a few questions you've sent in on the lead up to this, and hopefully I'll be able to pick up anything I've missed. Now, if you've watched any of my vlogs before, you know I always like to start off with the beginnings, and in this instance we need to look way back, before Rome was even a republic, at where Rome started using body armour. Back when Rome was still under kings, you had something called the Serbian Reforms. And this was something quite different. And we can see from this that in fact Rome at this point had its infantry fighting in the style of a hoplite. This meant spear-based infantry with the traditional bronze cuirass. However, the Serbian Reforms split the soldiery into different classes, linked directly to how much property they had. The richest class wore the cuirass, and those in the lower classes didn't. By the time Hannibal came along and the Punic Wars, generally in the 3rd century BC, Polybius gives us an overview of what the Roman infantry fought like. And to a man, they mainly fought with swords. This was a sword-based infantry rather than a spear one. The bronze cuirass seems to have been dropped altogether, though there were still nods and winks to the old Servian concept of richer getting the better armour. The poorer classes made do with a cardiophylax, and this is a square or circle of metal which covered the centre of the chest. Those who were richer could afford chainmail, or as the Romans knew it, Lorica Segmentata, and this was originally invented by the Celts of southeastern Europe. It wasn't Roman at all. It provided great defence against cutting strokes, which is brilliant if you're fighting swordsmen, but it was costly to make and quite heavy. We reckon it was around 15 kilograms, which would be tiresome even to sit around in, let alone fighting. Oh, and as you can see, it is quite unflattering. But Segmentata wasn't the only type of armour available at this time. Scale armour, or Lorica Segmentata as the Romans knew it, had been used by various peoples for centuries and was made of overlapping scales sewn onto a leather shirt. It gave good protection, but was less durable than mail. On the upside, it was far more stylish. Around the 1st century AD, the Romans started using plate armour, which is effectively what Lorica Segmentata is. In fact, I use the term Lorica Segmentata, but we don't actually know what the Romans originally called this type of armour. We think it was made of either mild steel or iron, but there is quite a bit of debate about that. And the obvious question is, why? Why did they change tack and suddenly develop something they'd never really tried much before? Well, let's have a look. Right inside the armour now, and hopefully you can see the leather straps at the back that held the upper part here from the lower parts down there. You've got your 4 quarters, you've got 1 here, you've got 2, 3 and 4. In case you're wondering, the reason why it's blackened inside is because this is rust-proof paint and it helps preserve the armour. As you can imagine, it was going to degrade quite quickly, which is something of a disadvantage and definitely something we'll come to later. With Segmentata, the weight's distributed far more across the back of the shoulders. You do feel a bit top heavy in comparison with the Segmentata and the Segmentata, where, as you've seen, it does hug the curves a bit, but the overall effect is that the centre of balance is far more natural. An obvious question is, why go for plate armour all of a sudden? Well, plate armour does one thing very well that neither Segmentata or Segmentata do as good, and that's handle blunt trauma. So if you have a sword striking you from either a chopping or a slashing blow, and you're wearing Segmentata or you're wearing Segmentata, it's not going to get through. You'll be fine. In that respect, you're not going to receive any cuts. What you will receive, though, is the trauma underneath. If that force gets through, it could lead to all sorts of injuries, and hopefully none too serious. Whereas plate armour, it just bounces off. In fact, overlapping plate armour handles this even better because the blow will literally slide off. Plate armour deals with blunt trauma far better than the Segmentata or the Segmentata could do. The blow is deflected, far better dealt with, and in fact, with overlapping plates, you even have it sliding off. One area of the Segmentata you might notice is really reinforced is the shoulder area, and you might initially wonder why that was. Perhaps this gives a better example as to why the shoulders were reinforced as they were. A Roman legionary facing you would normally be having his scutum right in front, around chest height, so you're not going to go through the front of him. The chances are you can either have a chopping blow or a slashing blow across the shoulders or neck, and having overlapping segmentata meant that that blow wouldn't be received well, and if it did at all make contact, it would slide off, and you're not going to get blunt trauma. Protection against the slashing or chopping type of attack can be seen elsewhere in the Roman armour. And then look at the helmet we have here, and again I've done a vlog on the helmet, so if you get a chance. Anyway, we've got a ridge across the brow here to stop any kind of chop down. We've also got the cheek guards as well, and this would have stopped anything getting onto the face, hopefully. Except this sort of attack wasn't exactly new. People have been trying to chop the bits off legionaries for some time prior to the segmenta coming along, so the strike across the top of the shoulders wasn't a brand new idea. So perhaps the reinforced area was purely a good idea in a new design of armour, rather than the driving motivation behind it. Probably a better way of looking and assessing the segmentata is to see how it sat alongside the hamata and squamata. Segmentata, though, is just like any armour. It has its good points and its bad points, its pros and cons, as it were. So let's consider what exactly they might be. In dealing with the cons, it doesn't exactly provide the coverage that the hamata and squamata do, especially, and forgive me, underneath the armpits. That said, it is a lot lighter than hamata and the squamata. The very thing that made squamata look so good, all those intricate little scales, was possibly one of its faults. If any of them became damaged during the battle, or simply because of poor maintenance and started coming off, then obviously the armour's not in the best condition it can be. And Lorica Segmentata, in a way, suffered from that same problem. It's made of 4 parts, as I've pointed out, and these are held together with leather. Now you can imagine, leather perishes, it gives up, it fails. And if part of this comes off mid-battle, you're in a really bad scenario. Now, thinking about maintenance and keeping the armour well oiled and making sure the leather's not about to fall off might seem quite a task, a challenge for an army. But Rome wasn't short in this capacity. In fact, this con could be quite easily managed. One thing that Rome did have in the 1st century AD was large numbers of soldiers who were based in camp, and many of these had a second trade, including blacksmithing. So here we have a good pool of skilled individuals who can maintain this segmentata as well as make spare sections of it. Hamata and squamata were harder to make and would have taken a higher skill level, whereas it would have been far easier, cheaper and quicker to make Lorica Segmentata. You can imagine in camps in those long winter months a few chaps being put aside purely to make sections and quarters of this to be kept aside in case of need. Hamata, yes, it gave you great coverage, and it also definitely stopped any cuts or choppings from getting into your skin. However, it wouldn't stop blunt trauma. That's a sort of injury that would get under the skin, and it could just be bruising, but it could be something far nastier. And finally, hamata was quite a lot heavier. In fact, we reckon around 15 kilograms, which is quite a bit more than the Lorica Segmentata, which could be between 8 and 10 kilograms. In fact, it may not have been the fact that the other armours weren't up to the task, or the fact that the fighting had changed much, that caused the introduction of the Lorica Segmentata. Consider it in terms of logistics. This is easier to make, it's quicker to make, and it was probably cheaper to make. If you've got a growing an army supporting a fledgling empire, this sort of thing was a very possible and attractive budget option. There's also one peripheral advantage which might be worth considering, or at least take into account. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal slaughtered the Romans, as you may well know, and I've done a vlog on it, so you might want to look at that. But he did so using a lot of equipment that he had won from the Romans at Trasimene. In antiquity, if you defeated an enemy, you had access to all their weapons and their armour. You usually ended up raiding their camp or stripping their soldiers on the battlefield. If you had a piece of kit which you knew how to maintain properly and you had the resources to maintain properly, you also knew how to wear it, because it does take a while to get used to. The enemy are less likely to want to pick this up. It doesn't give them that advantage. So if you were unlucky enough to lose to some Gaul or Celt, and they got hold of this, it's not going to be as easy for them. You're denying them that asset, as it were. Plus, thinking about it, and I referenced this at the beginning, this became something of an iconic image for the Romans. When you see it on Trajan's column, it stands alongside the Segmentata and the Harmata. So it would have been something the Romans may well have seen as being something that they made, and it's their creation. And it was a useful piece of PR for them, which I'll mention later. Now we come to the bit where I try and answer some of the questions that I got tweeted to me. Here we go. In terms of a blade getting through here, I can't see how it'd be able to fit. You're not going to get anything through there, and around this side, no. Quite simply, unless the armour is really damaged or failing in some way, you're simply not going to be able to get through any of these bands or hoops. Range of movement for the arms isn't too much of a problem. Yes, you're not as mobile as the Segmentata or the Harmata, and I've made that point. However, you weren't expected to be exactly a swashbuckling soldier when you're fighting in line in the infantry. You can still get your arms up, and you can still move side to side. If you're marching through safe country, the chances are you wouldn't be wearing your armour. However, if you were marching through new territory or generally on campaign, then yes, you would be. And perhaps that's why there was an emphasis to make this lighter, because those few extra kilograms that you didn't have to carry on around with you would make all the difference on a long march through enemy territory. The Segmentata may have came to represent Rome, but perhaps not in the way that you or I initially may have thought. It wasn't a super armour, it wasn't unbeatable, it was as good and as bad as the other options the Romans had. But it did represent this. It represented the logistical mindset that sat behind the growing Roman Empire. With this piece of kit, you had something cheaper and as effective as the other options in the field at the time. The fact that it required high maintenance, and the fact that you needed large numbers of it to be produced, and it could be produced in parts, may well have been a disadvantage to other tribes or kingdoms or factions at that time. But Rome could lap this up. They had that resource to be able to do it. For those reasons, it stands out to me as something uniquely Roman, and represents and reflects the Roman mentality and attitude to war. People associate propaganda in ancient Rome with buildings, with statues and coins, but I see it easily as evident here. I hope you've enjoyed watching this vlog, and thanks again for clicking.